Margaret Carter lived in a modest house in the heart of a small American town, surrounded by neighbors who had known her since she moved there with her late husband, Robert. The house, painted a soft shade of blue, reflected the love and care she had lavished on her family for so many years. The garden, once full of life with the flowers Robert loved to plant, was now just a silent reminder of a more vibrant past. After Robert's death, Margaret focused all her strength on raising her two children, Michael and Anna. She was always a present, loving mother who did everything to ensure that the children had a good life. Her evenings were dedicated to telling them stories before bed, and her mornings were filled with kisses and encouraging words so that they would have a happy day at school. "You're going to grow up and conquer the world," Margaret would say, sitting at the breakfast table as she served her children toast with jam. "And you'll be there with us, won't you, Mama?" asked Anna with her big blue eyes, always curious. "Of course, my dear. I'll always be close by," replied Margaret with an affectionate smile. Michael, more shy, just watched his mother, as if he wanted to absorb all the love she had to give. The years passed quickly, and Margaret saw her children grow up and excel in their respective fields. Michael, always ambitious, followed in his father's footsteps and graduated in business administration, while Anna, determined and intelligent, opted for marketing. They were Margaret's pride, and she never tired of telling the neighbors about her children's achievements. "Did you hear? Michael's been promoted," Margaret would say excitedly to Mrs. Jenkins, the next-door neighbor. "And Anna is working for a big company in New York. My children are doing so well." But as they prospered in their careers, their time with their mother diminished. Visits, which used to be weekly, became monthly, and then almost non-existent. Michael and Anna, now adults and busy with their own lives, barely had time to return her calls. Margaret tried to justify it to herself. "It's natural," she thought, sitting in her rocking chair on the balcony, watching the street go by. "They're busy. That's life. They always said they'd be here for me." Deep down, she knew that things were changing, but she preferred to believe that it was just a phase. After all, Michael and Anna had always been devoted children. They couldn't just forget about her. One afternoon, while Margaret was tending her flowers in the garden, her phone rang. She ran into the living room, her heart racing, hoping it was one of her children. It was Michael. "Mom, I'm just calling to say I'm fine. I'm in a meeting, but I wanted you to know," he said in a hurried voice. "Michael, how nice to hear your voice. I was just thinking about you today," said Margaret, holding the phone tightly, as if it would prolong the conversation. "Sorry, Mom, but I really need to get back to work now. I'll talk to you later, okay?" Margaret took a deep breath. "Of course, dear. I understand. Take care." The call ended before she could even ask when he planned to visit. The emptiness of the house seemed more oppressive after each quick call like that. A few days later, Anna called, also too busy to talk for more than a few minutes. "Mom, I miss you so much, but work is eating me up. I promise that next holiday we'll spend some time together." Margaret smiled as she heard her daughter's voice, but as she hung up, she felt the familiar pang of loneliness. She knew that promises like these were made with good intentions, but rarely kept. While her children moved on with their lives in the big city, Margaret remained in the house that had once been a home full of life, but was now plunged into silence. The laughter that echoed through the corridors was just a memory. The piano that Anna used to play stood in the corner of the room, gathering dust. The sound of Michael's quick steps up and down the stairs when he was younger, eager to play, now existed only in his memory. On the hardest days, Margaret would look at old photos. There was a family portrait hanging on the living room wall, taken in a park on one of Robert's birthdays. In the picture, they were all smiling. Robert with his calm gaze, Michael with his arms crossed, trying to look older than he was, Anna laughing at something only she understood, and Margaret with a sparkle in her eyes that now seemed distant. "I did everything right, didn't I?" she would whisper to herself in moments of introspection, staring at the still images that captured what seemed like another life. Margaret never regretted the choices she made as a mother. She knew that she had given her all so that Michael and Anna would have the best opportunities. However, the price of her sacrifice seemed to be the loneliness that now enveloped her. The weeks turned into months, and Margaret's routine became increasingly lonely. Her days were filled with simple tasks, tending the garden, watching old programs on television, and waiting for phone calls that rarely came. In the evenings, she would sit in her favorite armchair next to the fireplace, gazing into the dancing flames while wondering what the future still held for her. Margaret continued to love her children unconditionally, even in their absence. She knew that deep down, they still loved her too. But as time passed, the reality of a lonely life became inescapable. Michael and Anna had built their lives in the big city. It was what they had always dreamed of when they left the small town where they grew up. The skyline of imposing buildings, the frenetic traffic, and the rush of constant meetings became the new reality for both of them. They had achieved what they wanted: professional success and financial independence. Michael, the eldest, had become a renowned businessman in the real estate sector. His days were marked by long meetings, million-dollar deals, and the construction of new developments. He loved the hectic life. He felt in control. For him, the business world was exciting, challenging, and always rewarding. He fondly remembered his father's words, "You have a bright future, son. Go forth and conquer the world." Michael took this advice to heart, and every working day was another step in that direction. Anna, on the other hand, stood out in the world of digital marketing. Creative, intelligent, and extremely focused, she quickly rose through the ranks of the city's big agencies. Anna was the mind behind campaigns that reached millions of people, making brands grow exponentially. "I knew you'd do something big," Margaret used to say to her when, as a teenager, Anna shared her ideas of creating something that could be seen by everyone. Now her vision had come true. However, with success came the price: absence. They were both so immersed in their careers that time for their mother gradually diminished. They justified their absence with the common excuse, "Work is consuming me, but as soon as I have some time, I'll visit her." Margaret, always understanding, never complained directly, but deep down she missed her children more than she would ever admit. Her evenings were filled with memories of when Michael and Anna were children, running around the house, laughing and telling her about their days at school. Now, those memories were all that remained. One rainy afternoon, as Margaret watched the raindrops trickle down the window, her phone rang. She quickly got up from her rocking chair and went to answer it. It was Anna. "Mom, how are you?" "Sorry, I haven't called much. I'm on a huge campaign here, you know." Margaret smiled, although her heart was tight. "I'm fine, darling. I miss you. When will you be able to come and see me?" Anna paused. "I wish it were soon, Mom. But right now, things are so crazy here. I have tight deadlines, demanding clients. I promise, as soon as I get a break, I'll come over." Margaret tried to hide her disappointment. "I understand, dear. Just don't forget to rest too. You're working too hard." "I know, Mom. I'm looking after myself. What about you? Are you all right? Are you eating properly?" Anna tried to change the focus of the conversation. "Yes, dear, I'm fine. Don't worry about me," Margaret replied, even though she knew the reality was different. Hanging up the phone, Margaret sat back in the rocking chair, feeling the weight of the silence. Conversations were getting shorter and shorter, and promises of a visit seemed further and further away. Across town, Michael was in a meeting with investors. He was the kind of man who was always on the move, never stopping to reflect much on life outside of business. After the meeting, he picked up his cell phone and saw several notifications. Among them was a message from his mother, sent a few days earlier. "How are you, my son? We haven't spoken in a while." Michael sighed. He loved his mother, of course, but work always came first. He quickly typed a reply. "Hi, Mom. Sorry it took so long. I'm fine, just very busy. I'll talk to you later, okay?" And with that, he put the phone away, already immersed in the next project. Margaret, on the other hand, waited patiently. Every day she looked at her watch, hoping for a call, a surprise visit, or even a message that would make her feel that her children still cared about her the way she cared about them. However, the reality was that they were both so involved in their hectic lives in the city that Margaret had become a distant memory. One evening during a business dinner, Michael heard a coworker ask, "And your family, how are they?" He paused for a moment. "Well, my father passed away a few years ago. My mother still lives in the town where we grew up." "Do you visit her often?" asked his colleague. Michael, not knowing how to answer, tried to disguise it. "Not as much as I'd like, but we're always in touch." That simple question made him think. He hadn't seen his mother for months. The last time he had visited Margaret, it had been for a few hours, and he had barely taken his eyes off his cell phone. And now he was stuck in a business routine that seemed to have no end. Across town, Anna was also feeling pressured by work. Deadlines, demands, and constant travel kept her away from home. One evening, while reviewing an important campaign, a memory surfaced. She remembered a summer afternoon when she was still a teenager, sitting with her mother in the backyard. Margaret was telling stories about her own childhood, and Anna, fascinated, was listening intently. "Mom, one day, I want to be like you know?" Anna had said that sunny afternoon. Margaret smiled and replied, "No, darling, you're going to be so much more than I ever was. You're going to conquer the world." Now, years later, Anna wondered if her mother still felt the same way. She had conquered the world, but at what cost? When had she last visited her? The days went by, and life in the big city continued relentlessly. The success they had both achieved, although gratifying, took them away from the person who loved them most. Margaret remained in her small town, waiting for a visit, a longer phone call, something to make her feel that she was still part of her children's lives. But Michael and Anna were too busy to realize that time wasn't waiting for them, and that every day away was one less day at their mother's side. Over the years, Margaret's health began to decline. She was no longer able to keep house on her own, and daily activities such as preparing dinner or even climbing the stairs became a challenge. Margaret still looked forward to visits from Michael and Anna, but she knew deep down that these moments of reunion were rare and often an empty promise. It was then, after a medical consultation, that her doctor suggested she hire a caregiver. "Margaret, you need help. You can't keep doing everything on your own. I know you're strong, but we all need support at some point," he said, his voice calm but firm. Margaret was reluctant at first. "I don't want to be a burden to anyone. My children already have so much to worry about," she replied, clutching her handbag in her lap, a gesture that denoted her resistance to the idea of depending on anyone. "It's not a question of being a burden, Margaret. Think of it as a way of ensuring that you have a good quality of life. And who knows, maybe a caregiver could even become a good companion," the doctor suggested. Margaret thought about it on the way home. The idea of having a stranger in her home didn't appeal to her. However, the doctor was right. She could no longer take care of herself as she used to, and the loneliness she felt on a daily basis was beginning to weigh on her. A few days later, she decided to follow his advice and contacted a care agency. That's how Ethan came into her life. He was a young man in his 20s with a calm look and a warm smile. Margaret initially didn't know what to expect. "He's so young," she thought when she first saw him. However, Ethan soon proved to be more than just a caregiver. He had a rare patience and an ability to listen that surprised Margaret. On the very first day, as he helped Margaret into her armchair, he started chatting. "I know it can be strange having someone new here, but I want you to know that I'm here for you, Mrs. Margaret," said Ethan, with a kindness that calmed her worries. Margaret smiled back, still cautious. "Thank you, Ethan. I'm not used to help, but I'll try." The days passed, and Ethan became part of Margaret's routine. Not only did he help her with her daily chores, but he also spent hours talking to her. Margaret, who had previously found herself alone in her large house, now had someone who cared about her well-being. Ethan listened to her stories about her youth, how she met Robert, her late husband, and the joys and challenges of raising Michael and Anna. Robert was a wonderful man. He always said that he wanted his children to have more than he had. And in a way, they did. But sometimes I wonder if they're really happy, Margaret said one afternoon, while looking out of the window. Ethan, who was sitting next to her, reflected for a moment before answering. "I think happiness is relative. Maybe what they see as happiness is different from what you expected. But I'm sure they love you, even from afar." Margaret sighed. "I know they love me, but the love they had when they were little, it seems that love is distant now." These conversations became frequent. Ethan, with his sensitivity, knew that Margaret carried an emotional burden far greater than her poor physical health, and he was there to listen to her, without judgment, offering the support she so desperately needed, even if she didn't know how to ask for it. One night, after helping Margaret get ready for bed, Ethan decided to share a bit of his own life. "You know, Mrs. Margaret, I also grew up without much contact with my parents. They were always busy. Maybe that's why I understand a little of how you feel." Margaret looked at him in surprise. "I didn't know that. That must have been difficult." "It was, But at the same time, it taught me to value the connections we have with the people who are close to us, no matter how long they last. I may not have had my parents around, but I had my grandparents, and they were my anchor," Ethan explained, his eyes slightly watery. Margaret, touched by Ethan's sincerity, realized that despite their age difference, they had a lot in common. She felt a growing affection for the young man, who not only fulfilled his tasks, but also showed a rare empathy. Over time, Ethan became the person Margaret trusted completely. "Ethan, you've been more than a caregiver to me. I don't know what I'd do without you here. You remind me that there's still good in the world," said Margaret in an affectionate tone. Ethan, always humble, smiled. "I just do what I think anyone would do. You're special, and I feel privileged to be here with you." As the months passed, the relationship between the two grew even stronger. Margaret no longer saw Ethan as someone who was only there to help her physically, but as a friend, perhaps even as a son she never had. Michael and Anna remained distant, with sporadic phone calls and promises to visit that never materialized. Meanwhile, Ethan was there every day, offering the comfort and companionship that Margaret craved. One winter's day, Margaret and Ethan were sitting together in the living room, the fire in the fireplace warming the room. Margaret looked at Ethan and in a soft voice said, "You know, Ethan, when my children were little, I used to say that they were going to conquer the world, and they really did. But the world they conquered took them away from me." Ethan, hearing Margaret's words, reflected for a few moments before replying, "Perhaps, Mrs. Margaret, the world they have conquered is different from what you imagined. But here, in this house, there is another kind of conquest. A conquest that involves caring, loving, and being present." Margaret smiled, her eyes shining with tears that she refused to let fall. "Maybe you're right, Ethan. Maybe the real achievement is this: being here now with those who really care." From that moment on, Margaret knew that Ethan wasn't just a caregiver, but someone she could call family. He brought light to the dark days, and his presence became essential to Margaret's emotional well-being. The large house, which had once seemed empty, was now filled with conversation, laughter, and new hope. Although Margaret's children were far away, she had found in Ethan the affection and companionship that had been so lacking. And so Margaret's life took on a new meaning, thanks to the dedication and affection of a young caregiver who came into her life when she needed it most. As the years went by, Michael and Anna became even more distant from Margaret's life. Quick phone conversations became more and more sparse, and promises to visit fell by the wayside. Margaret, for her part, tried to keep in touch, sending messages and making phone calls whenever she felt her children had been silent for too long. "Hi, son. How are you? We haven't spoken in a while," Margaret would say with hope in her voice whenever she called Michael. "Hi, Mom. I'm sorry, I've been rushing around here, but I'm fine. Everything okay?" Michael's answer was always the same, quick and without much emotion. "I'm fine, yeah. I just wanted to see how you were. When will you be able to visit me?" Margaret asked softly, trying not to sound desperate. "Oh, Mom, I really don't know. Things are complicated here. I'll try to come by next month, I promise," Michael replied, his voice tired on the other end of the line. Margaret sighed quietly. She had heard this promise before, and deep down she knew he probably wouldn't come. "All right, son. Take care, okay?" On the other side, Margaret hung up the phone and stared at the emptiness. Her house, once full of life, now seemed emptier and emptier. Michael and Anna's laughter, which echoed through the corridors when they conceived they were children, had been replaced by the sound of the wind hitting the windows. The family photos hanging on the walls still showed smiles, but these smiles were from a time long gone. Anna, for her part, was not much different from Michael when it came to keeping in touch. She was also busy with her career, and although she loved her mother, time always seemed to slip out of her hands. "Hi, Mom," Anna would say when she answered her calls, usually on the way from one meeting to another. "Hi, my dear. How are you? It's been so long since we talked." "Oh, Mom, I'm running here. I just wanted to tell you that I'm fine. How are you?" Margaret, always patient, replied, "I'm fine. I just miss you. When do you think you can come and see me?" "I'd love to, Mom, but I'm swamped with work. I promise I'll try to stop by next holiday." "That's all right, dear. I know you're busy," Margaret replied, trying to hide her disappointment. However, the holidays came and went, and Margaret kept waiting. At first, she thought it was just a phase and that eventually her children would come back to visit her more often. But as time went by, she realized that the distance between them went far beyond the geographical. They were emotionally distant. One evening, after another hurried call from Anna, Margaret sat in her favorite armchair, watching the flames in the fireplace. Ethan, who had been helping out around the house for a few months, noticed the sad look on her face. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Margaret?" he asked, his voice soft as he sat down next to her. Margaret looked at him and smiled, although her eyes were watery. "I'm fine, Ethan. I was just thinking about how things have changed over time. When my children were little, they were always around me. Now I hardly see them." Ethan nodded sympathetically. He knew how much this absence affected her, even if Margaret didn't talk about it often. Sometimes life pulls people in different directions, but that doesn't mean they don't love you, Mrs. Margaret. "I know they love me, Ethan. I just miss them." When Michael and Anna were children, the house was full of life. They ran around the corridors, laughed, played in the garden. "And now everything is so quiet," said Margaret, her voice breaking. Ethan remained silent for a moment, respecting the pain Margaret was carrying. "I imagine it's hard, but maybe they're just trying to find their own way. It may be that in time, things will change." Margaret smiled slightly, but knew that Ethan's words, although kind, were no guarantee that her children would ever be present in her life again. Time passed quickly, and every day they were apart seemed to increase the distance between them. A few days later, Margaret received a message from Michael. "Mom, I'm sorry, but I won't be able to make it this weekend. I promise I'll stop by soon." She looked at her phone, read the message, and after a few seconds replied, "All right, my son, I'll be here." That was Margaret's reality. She would always be there, waiting for them, but not knowing if they would ever be an active part of her life again. Even so, she never blamed them. In her heart, Margaret understood that life in the big city had its demands, and that Michael and Anna were trying to build their own stories. Once, in a conversation with Ethan, Margaret revealed one of her greatest fears. "You know, Ethan, sometimes I wonder if I've done something wrong, if somehow I haven't been enough for my children. Maybe they feel they don't need me anymore." Ethan looked at Margaret sincerely. "I don't believe that, Mrs. Margaret. From what you've told me, you were an incredible mother. Maybe they're so focused on their own lives that they don't realize how much you need them right now." "I hope you're right," said Margaret, trying to remain optimistic. Deep down, however, she knew that the clock was ticking, and she was increasingly dependent on Ethan, not only for day-to-day tasks, but also to fill the emotional void her children had left behind. As Margaret continued her routine with Ethan's constant company, she found herself reflecting on what really mattered in life. Her children's successes and achievements filled her with pride, but also made her question the price of that success. What was more valuable, the money, the achievements, or the simple act of being there for those we love? Despite all these questions, Margaret clung to the hope that one day Michael and Anna would realize what she wanted most. Not an expensive gift, not a visit planned in advance, but just a simple afternoon when they could talk, laugh, and share time together again. Margaret knew that life moved on, but she hoped that, before it was too late, her children would realize that true wealth lay in the connections we create and maintain, not in the achievements we accumulate. Until then, she would wait. She would always wait. It was an autumn afternoon, and the yellowing leaves covered the ground in Margaret's backyard, creating a melancholy yet beautiful landscape. The wind blew gently, and the air carried the scent of dried leaves. Margaret was sitting in her rocking chair, watching the trees move while Ethan, as usual, tended to the plants in the garden. She knew that time was passing her by relentlessly, and although she didn't like to admit it, she felt that something was changing inside her. The exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was an emotional fatigue that she'd been carrying around for years. "Ethan, come here, please," Margaret called, her voice gentle but with a tone he wasn't used to hearing. Ethan immediately put down the rake he was using to clear the leaves and went over to her. "Of course, Mrs. Margaret. What do you need?" She looked at him for a moment, as if gathering her strength for what she needed to say. There was something in Margaret's eyes that made Ethan realize this was no ordinary conversation. There was a certain urgency, a need to say something that she had been holding in for a long time. "Ethan, I feel like I'm running out of time," she said, her voice trembling. It was the first time she had spoken to him about it. Ethan felt a lump in his throat, but tried to remain calm. "Don't say that, Mrs. Margaret. You still have a long time to go." Margaret shook her head slowly. Ah, Ethan, I've lived a long time. I feel it. Here. She lightly touched her chest where her heart was beating weakly. And I know that, when the time comes, I want some things to be clear. Ethan knelt down beside her, taking her hand gently. You have all the time in the world to say what you want, Mrs. Margaret. I'm here and I'm not going anywhere. She smiled tenderly, squeezing Ethan's hand gently. I know, Ethan. That's why I need to tell you a few things now, while I still can. You've been a real blessing in my life, more than anyone could have imagined. I don't know how I would have got through these last few years without you by my side. Ethan, visibly moved, tried to disguise the tears that were beginning to form in his eyes. I just did my job, Mrs. Margaret. You've always been very good to me. No, Ethan, it wasn't just a job. You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. Companionship, affection, understanding. You were there for me when I needed you most, when I felt most alone. And for that, I want you to know that when I'm gone, you'll be part of my legacy, Margaret said with a sincerity that pierced Ethan's heart. He was silent for a moment, trying to process what she was saying. Mrs. Margaret, I don't know what to say. You've given me so much more than I could have imagined. This job, it wasn't just a job for me. You've become family to me. Margaret smiled, touched by Ethan's words. I'm glad to hear that, because you've become part of my family too, Ethan. You're the son who stood by me when my own children were too busy to remember that they still have a mother. Silence took over for a moment. The wind continued to blow gently, making the leaves dance across the yard. Margaret looked at the horizon. The sun was beginning to set, tinting the sky with shades of orange and pink. I've been thinking a lot about what will become of my house when I leave, Margaret continued. Michael and Anna, they have their lives. They don't need this house. And I know that, for them, it doesn't mean what it means to me. But you, Ethan, you've been here every day, helping to look after this place, making every corner of this house more alive. Ethan looked at her, surprised at what she seemed to be implying. Mrs. Margaret, I don't know what to say. You mean? Yes, Ethan. When I'm gone, I want you to have this house. I want this to be your home because you've earned it more than anyone else. Here you'll be able to continue the work you started, maybe even help other people like you did me. Ethan bowed his head, trying to hold back the tears that, this time, he couldn't hold back. Mrs. Margaret, I don't know if I deserve this. I only did what I thought was right. You've given me so much more than I could have imagined. And now you're offering me something I never expected. Margaret reached up to touch Ethan's face, wiping away a tear that was rolling down his cheek. You deserve it, Ethan, and I want you to know that this is my last will. Michael and Anna will have their lives, and I've already left them something. But the house is yours. I want you to take care of it like you took care of me. Ethan, still emotional, nodded. I promise I'll honor your memory, Mrs. Margaret. I will make this house a place of love and care, as it was for you. Margaret smiled, feeling a weight lifted from her shoulders. She knew Ethan would keep his promise. He had always been loyal and caring, more than anyone could have expected from someone so young. Margaret looked up at the sky again, the sun now almost gone over the horizon. I feel like I can rest in peace now, Ethan. Knowing that you'll take care of everything gives me peace of mind, Margaret said with a serenity that, until then, Ethan had never seen in her. They sat in silence for a few more minutes, enjoying each other's company as dusk enveloped the world around them. Margaret knew that her time was coming to an end, but as she looked at Ethan, she felt at peace. She had found not just a caregiver, but a true friend, someone who was there for her in her most difficult moments. Before getting up to help Margaret inside, Ethan spoke in a voice that was firm, but full of emotion. I'll never forget what you did for me, and I promise that, wherever you are, you'll be proud of me. Margaret just smiled, certain that her last words had been heard and that her legacy was safe. The morning Margaret died, the house was silent. The air seemed heavier than usual, and the sun, which usually illuminated the living room windows, could barely penetrate the gray clouds that covered the sky. Ethan had spent the night looking after Margaret, noticing that her health had been deteriorating over the last few days. He knew deep down that the moment was near, but he refused to accept that farewell was so imminent. Margaret no longer had the same strength as before. She was lying on her bed, her eyes closed, breathing slowly. Her face, which had smiled at Ethan so many times, now showed an expression of tiredness, but also of peace. She had prepared herself for this moment, and her last conversation with Ethan a few days ago had made everything clear. She was ready. Ethan, who had become accustomed to listening to Margaret's stories while looking after the house, was now silent beside her. He sat in a chair next to the bed, holding her hand tightly without letting go. Margaret didn't speak, but her presence was strong, and Ethan felt that even with her eyes closed, she knew he was there. In a moment, Margaret slowly opened her eyes. The sparkle that had once illuminated her gaze was now weaker, but the kindness still remained. She turned her head slightly towards Ethan and smiled, almost imperceptibly. "You're here," she murmured, her voice weak but full of affection. "Yes, Mrs. Margaret, I'm here," Ethan replied, his voice breaking but trying to stay strong for her. He knew that these words were probably the last that he would hear from her. "Thank you for everything," she whispered, squeezing his hand with what little strength she still had. Ethan felt the light but meaningful squeeze. "Thank you, Mrs. Margaret. You've given me so much more than I could ever have imagined," he said, trying to remain calm, but feeling tears gathering in his eyes. Margaret closed her eyes again, as if she was too tired to continue speaking. She took a deep breath, the sound of her breathing slow and fragile. Ethan stood there in silence, holding her hand, following every gentle movement of her chest, rising and falling. He knew there was nothing more to be said. Everything that needed to be shared between them had already been said over the previous days. Margaret was at peace with her departure, and Ethan felt honored to be by her side at this final moment. Time seemed to pass slowly. The house, which had always been a refuge for Margaret, now became the place of her farewell. Every corner of the house held a memory. Every piece of furniture, a story. Ethan looked around and remembered all the conversations, laughs, and moments he had shared with Margaret there. The silence that now filled the room seemed to echo all those memories. Suddenly, Margaret's breathing began to slow down, becoming more and more spaced out. Ethan felt his heart clench. He knew what was coming, but still, nothing could have prepared him for this moment. "I'm here," he said again, more to himself than to Margaret, in an attempt to make sure she didn't leave alone. In one last gasp, Margaret stopped breathing. The grip on her hand relaxed, and a deep silence took over the room. Ethan stood there motionless, feeling the emptiness that now filled the space where there had once been life. He didn't know how long he sat next to Margaret, holding her hand. Time seemed to stand still. Eventually, he carefully released her hand, placed it on the blanket, and stood up slowly. Sadness enveloped him like a heavy cloak, but at the same time, there was a lightness in knowing that Margaret was finally at peace, free from suffering. Ethan left the room, feeling that he had lost someone very dear to him. Although he knew that Margaret's death was inevitable, that didn't make the moment any less painful. He walked slowly down the stairs and stopped in the living room, looking at the empty house. Everything seemed different now, quieter than ever. Hours later, Michael and Anna arrived at the house. Ethan had warned them about Margaret's worsening condition a few days earlier, but they had been too busy, as usual, to visit her. Now they were there, too late. Michael entered first, his countenance serious. Anna followed, her eyes full of tears. But she didn't say anything. They knew they hadn't been there as they should have been, and the guilt was already beginning to weigh heavily on both their shoulders. Is she gone?" asked Michael, his voice low, almost a whisper, as if he was afraid of the answer. Ethan nodded. "Yes, she left this morning. She went peacefully." Anna covered her face with her hands, beginning to cry silently. Michael, although trying to keep his composure, also let out a few tears, which he tried to cover up, but to no avail. Ethan watched them both, trying not to judge them. He knew that despite everything, they were Margaret's children, and somehow, they were suffering too. "Did she say anything before she left?" asked Anna, wiping her tears with the sleeve of her blouse. Ethan took a deep breath, remembering Margaret's last words. She said, "Thank you," and she was at peace. She knew it was time. Michael nodded, but the expression on his face clearly showed the regret he felt. "I should have come sooner. I should have been here?" Ethan didn't reply, but the silence between them said it all. He knew that at that moment, any words would be insufficient to fill the void that Margaret had left. The three of them sat in silence for a while. The house seemed so big and empty now that Margaret was no longer there. The memories of the days when the house was full of life, with Margaret's laughter and stories, were now just distant memories. Ethan stepped back a little, letting Michael and Anna have a moment alone with the house and the memories of their mother. He knew that, however distant they had been, the bond between them and Margaret was still there, and the grief would inevitably catch up with them. As the sun began to set, casting a soft light over the house, Ethan sat on the porch reflecting on everything that had happened. He had promised Margaret that he would take care of her home and her legacy, and now that responsibility was his. Although his heart was heavy with loss, Ethan knew that what Margaret wanted was clear. Her spirit and her memory would live on through every action he took from now on. She had gone in peace, and he would do everything he could to honor her memory. After Margaret's death, the atmosphere in the house became dense and silent. Michael and Anna were sitting in the living room, still absorbing the loss of their mother. The house, which had once been full of life, now seemed heavy, and the emptiness that Margaret's absence had left was palpable. They knew that the family lawyer would be arriving soon to read the will, and they were both trying to process their emotions, each in their own way. "I should have come sooner," whispered Anna, looking at a photo of the family hanging on the wall, where everyone seemed happy and united. She remembered the countless times she had promised to visit her mother, but had always put it off. Michael, standing next to her, shook his head. "Yes, we both should." His voice was deep, reflecting the weight of guilt he also felt. They had been consumed by their lives and careers, and now there was no time to make amends. Ethan, who was in the kitchen organizing some things, watched the scene in silence. He knew that this moment was important for Margaret's children, but he also had the feeling that something significant was about to happen. Soon the lawyer, a middle-aged man with a serious appearance, arrived at the house. He entered, carrying a worn leather briefcase containing Margaret's will. Michael and Anna stood up and shook his hand, visibly uncomfortable. Ethan stood aside, waiting to be called, as he knew he was also part of Margaret's last will. The lawyer sat down at the table and carefully opened the folder. "My condolences on the loss of your mother. Margaret was an admirable woman, and she left me clear instructions on how she wanted her last wishes to be carried out." Michael and Anna nodded, anxious but at the same time apprehensive. They imagined that they would inherit the house, the savings, and any other assets that Margaret had. After all, they were her children, and however absent they had been, they believed that this would be the natural way of things. "I'll start with what Margaret asked me to share with you," said the lawyer, adjusting his glasses and picking up a sheet of paper. "Firstly, she expressed a deep love for you both. Margaret was a mother who loved you unconditionally, and that is clear from her words here." Anna sighed, crossing her arms. The pain of hearing about her mother's love, even after being so far away, was suffocating. Michael remained silent, his gaze fixed on the lawyer. "However," the lawyer continued, "she also wanted to be honest about how she had felt over the last few years. Margaret mentioned how much she missed you. She understood that your lives were busy, but loneliness accompanied you in the final years of your life." These words fell like a stone on both of them. Anna began to cry silently, and Michael clenched his hands, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. Neither of them knew what to say. The guilt they were already feeling now seemed unbearable. The lawyer paused briefly before continuing. "In her will, Margaret left most of her estate to Ethan." Michael and Anna immediately raised their heads in surprise. "What?" Michael asked, stunned. "She left the house to him?" Ethan, who was standing in the corner of the room, watching, lowered his eyes, feeling the weight of the moment. He knew that Margaret had left him something, but he hadn't expected it to be the whole house. "Yes," said the lawyer, confirming. "Margaret left her house and most of her savings to Ethan in recognition of the care, support, and companionship he had offered her over the last few years." Anna, in shock, looked at Ethan, trying to understand. "But we're her children. How can she do this?" Margaret made it clear that, although she loved you both deeply, it was Ethan who was by her side during the last years of her life, the lawyer explained calmly. She felt that he took care of her like no one else, and so she believed that he should inherit what she valued most, her home and her financial security. Silence filled the room again. Anna tried to hold back her tears while Michael remained incredulous. Both were processing not only the loss of their mother, but also the fact that her absence in recent years had directly influenced Margaret's decisions. "But what did she leave for us?" asked Michael, trying to regain control of the situation. He couldn't believe that his own mother had left them out. The lawyer looked at the next page of the will. Margaret set aside a small amount for her grandchildren, your children, Michael and Anna. She wanted to ensure that future generations would have something from her. "And for us?" asked Anna, almost dreading the answer. "She left a personal letter for each of you," said the lawyer, handing over 2 sealed envelopes. "In these letters, Margaret expresses her feelings and final wishes for you." Michael and Anna took the envelopes, looking at them without opening them immediately. It was as if the contents were a final confrontation with their mother, something they weren't ready to face. "Ethan," continued the lawyer, turning to him, "Margaret has asked you to continue to look after this house, just as you looked after her. She believed that you would maintain the spirit of compassion and care that she valued so much." Ethan, still in shock, nodded slowly. "I will do that. I'll take care of the house and honor her memory." The lawyer closed the folder and stood up. "That concludes the reading of the will. If there are any doubts or questions, I'll be at your disposal." Michael and Anna remained silent, unable to fully process what had just happened. For them, the house had always been a symbol of their family, a place they expected to inherit as a matter of course, without ever imagining that its absence in recent years would make such a difference. Ethan, on the other hand, felt torn. He knew that Margaret had considered him a friend and companion in the loneliest moments of her life, but he had never expected to inherit something as grand as their home. He was grateful, but he also understood the impact of this decision on Margaret's children. When the lawyer left, Michael finally broke the silence. "She left us out because we weren't here," he said, his voice bitter. "We let it happen." Anna, still holding her mother's envelope, looked at Ethan with sad eyes. "She did what she thought was right. We can't change what happened." Ethan remained silent, knowing that although Margaret had left in peace, the weight of her decisions would still echo in those who remained. The silence in the house was still oppressive as Michael and Anna each held their envelopes. Their hands trembled slightly, and the tension that filled the air seemed suffocating. Neither of them knew how to begin. What had Margaret written to them? What words would she use to explain her choices in her will? The letters seemed to weigh much more than their size indicated, as if they contained not only words, but also the feelings of a lifetime. Finally, Anna broke the silence, speaking in a low voice. "Are you going to open it now?" She looked at her brother, hoping that he would be the first to take this difficult step. Michael sighed deeply, feeling the weight of guilt and regret mixed together. "I think we do. I think we owe it to her." He began to tear the seal off the envelope, trying to stay calm, while Anna watched, still hesitant. The two of them settled down on the sofa side by side, just like when they were children. Only now the reason wasn't joy, but an emptiness that consumed them. Michael pulled the letter out of the envelope and began to read it silently. The paper was slightly yellowed, as if Margaret had written it some time ago, waiting for the right moment to hand it over. "My dear son, Michael," the letter began. His mother's words immediately brought up a whirlwind of emotions. "I know that life often takes us away from those we love, and I understand that your choices were made with the desire to prosper and build a better future. But the truth is that what I've longed for most in recent years is your presence." Michael felt a lump in his throat. He continued reading, his eyes watering. "I remember when you were little, always determined and full of energy. You always dreamed of conquering the world, and I was so proud to see the man you became. However, what I missed most was the boy who came running home from school, full of stories to tell. I understood your busy life, but my heart as a mother always longed for more moments with you." Anna, who was watching her brother read, could no longer contain her curiosity and fear. She decided to open her own letter, her hands trembling slightly. As she took out the sheet of paper, she saw her mother's smooth handwriting, something she hadn't seen for a long time. "My dear daughter, Anna," Margaret's letter to her began, "I always knew you had an amazing inner strength, and watching you become this strong, independent woman has been one of the greatest joys of my life. I'm proud of everything you've achieved, but at the same time, I deeply regretted that those achievements took you away from me." Anna swallowed, struggling not to cry. Her mother's words echoed directly in her heart. I understand that the professional world demands a lot, and that the responsibilities you have taken on have not been easy. But darling, I've always wished that you would take a moment to come back, to visit me, to sit with me like we did when you were little, talking about your dreams and ideas. Michael stopped reading for a moment and looked at Anna. She too had tears in her eyes, struggling to keep her composure. She just wanted us to be here, he said, his voice heavy with regret. Anna nodded, wiping away the tears that were starting to flow. We left her alone, Michael. She needed us, and we were too busy with our own lives. They read again in silence, each immersed in the words that seemed to cut through their souls. In Michael's letter, Margaret continued, I never stopped loving you, even at times when the distance between us seemed unbearable. I was always proud of your achievements, but success in the world means nothing if we forget who we are and where we came from. I don't want you to carry guilt, my son, but I do want you to know that the true richness of life lies in the connections we make with those we love. In Anna's letter, Margaret's words were equally painful and tender. I dreamed so many times of the day when you would walk through that door, unannounced, just to spend an afternoon with me. But that day never came. I don't hold any sorrows, my child, because I know that you loved me in your own way. I just wanted you to know that, for me, nothing in the world could compare to the joy of spending time with you. As the two brothers continued to read, their expressions changed from sadness to deep regret. Each line Margaret wrote revealed the love she had always felt, but also the pain she'd been carrying for the past few years. She didn't blame them directly, but their absence had left deep scars on her heart. I want you to live your lives to the full, but don't forget to cherish the simple moments, to be with the people who matter. Because in the end, it's those moments that really count. The end of Michael's letter read, I will always love you, no matter the distance or the time. And even though I'm not physically here anymore, I want you to know that my love for you is eternal. Anna's letter ended with a final tone of farewell and forgiveness. When they had both finished reading, the room fell silent again. The letters now rested on their laps, and the weight of what they had read was almost unbearable. Michael wiped his eyes, trying to organize his thoughts. She knew we were busy, but all she wanted was for us to be here, he said, almost in a whisper. Anna, still holding the letter tightly, replied in a shaky voice, We've let her down, Michael. She never said that, but we left her alone. Ethan, who was watching from afar, knew that this was an intimate moment between the brothers and their mother, even if she was no longer present. He knew how much Margaret had suffered from their absence, but he also knew that, in a way, she had found peace before she left. Anna looked at Michael and sighed. What are we going to do now? Michael looked at the house, the portraits, everything around them. We're going to honor what she asked of us. We're going to remember to value what really matters and never let it happen again. With those words, they stood up, aware that although it was too late to change the past, there was still time to learn from the mistakes they had made and move forward with the legacy of love that Margaret had left them. After reading the will and the letters, Michael and Anna were deeply shaken. The regret they both felt was overwhelming, and the house that had once seemed like a reminder of a distant past now became a symbol of their failings. Sitting side by side in the living room, the silence between them was dense, heavy. Margaret's absence was palpable, and the emptiness she had left behind seemed to grow inside them. Anna was the first to break the silence. How could we let this happen, Michael? Her voice was fragile, broken with grief. She spent years waiting for us, and we were always too busy. Michael shook his head, fighting back the tears that insisted on flowing. He had always been the stronger brother, the one who dealt with things in a practical way, but at that moment, even he couldn't find words of consolation. I don't know, Anna. I thought there would be more time. I always thought I could go and see her later, after work slowed down, after business stabilized, but the after never came. Anna looked at him, her eyes watering. I did the same thing. I'd tell myself that the next holiday I'd go, but when the next holiday came around, something more important always came up. She paused, squeezing the envelope of her mother's letter between her fingers. There are no more holidays now. Michael sighed deeply, wiping his hand across his face. We left you alone, Anna. We had our lives, our achievements, but what good was all that? What good was all that success if, in the end, we couldn't be with the people who really mattered? Ethan, who until then had remained silent, watching the brothers from afar, felt the urge to intervene, but hesitated. He knew that this was an important moment for Michael and Anna, a moment when they needed to deal with the truth about what they had neglected. However, he also knew that Margaret had never wanted them to be consumed with guilt. Their mother loved them unconditionally, despite the distance. Finally, Ethan stepped forward. "I know you're hurting right now, but Mrs. Margaret didn't want you to live with regret. She told me that she understood how complicated your life was. She missed you, it's true, but she didn't hold grudges." Anna looked at Ethan with tear-filled eyes. "But how can we not regret it, Ethan? We failed her. We let our own lives take us away from the person who gave us everything." Ethan gave a small smile full of sadness. "Regret is natural, Anna, but I was with your mother until the end, and I know that she loved you, even from afar. She knew you had your reasons, even if it hurt her. What matters now is what you do with that feeling." Michael frowned, processing what Ethan had said. "And what can we do, Ethan? She's gone. We can't go back in time. We can't fix what we've done." "No," Ethan replied calmly. "You can't go back in time, but you can honor her memory by living differently from now on. Margaret told me that she wanted you to find a balance, to cherish the connections with the people you love, before time slips through your hands again." Anna, with tears streaming down her face, nodded slowly. "I feel like we've let you down, Michael. Not being here, not giving her the time she deserved. I don't know how to move on from this." Michael turned to his sister, finally allowing the tears to fall. "We've both let her down, Anna. But as Ethan said, maybe we can still honor what she wanted. She taught us a lesson, a hard lesson, but a necessary one." The house seemed to breathe with a new kind of silence, a silence that carried Margaret's memories and the memory of what she had left her children. The family photos hanging on the walls, the antique furniture she loved so much, and even the sound of the trees swaying in the yard brought a sense of painful nostalgia. Anna stood up and walked over to one of the old photos, where Margaret was smiling next to Michael and Anna, still children. "She was an incredible mother, Michael, and we left her all alone." Michael stood up slowly and walked over to his sister, stopping next to her. He looked at the same photo, and a sense of deep loss hit him. "Yes, she's gone, and we'll carry that forever." "Maybe this isn't a curse," Ethan said, moving closer to the two of them. "Maybe it's a reminder that life doesn't wait. You have your families, you have people around you who are still here. If you can learn something from that, something that makes you live more consciously, then the regret won't be in vain." Michael looked at Ethan, surprised by the depth of his words. "You're very wise for someone your age, Ethan." Ethan smiled, still with a gentle sadness on his face. "I learned a lot from your mother. She taught me that time is the most precious commodity we have. And unfortunately, she knew that people often realize this too late." Anna wiped away her tears and turned to the two of them. "So what do we do now? How do we move on from all this?" Michael took a deep breath and looked at the house around him. "We do what she asked us to do. We find a way to value what matters, to be there for the people we love. And above all, we take care of each other." Ethan nodded. "That would be the best way to honor his memory." Anna smiled softly, a sad but sincere smile. "She'd be happy with that," Michael agreed. Yes, she would. The three of them were silent for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. But in that silence, something had changed. The regret was still there, but now it felt like a bridge to something greater, the chance to reconnect with what really mattered. Margaret was gone, but her lessons, conveyed in her last words and in her life dedicated to love and family, would remain. And somehow, even after death, she was still able to guide them to the path they needed to follow. After reading the letters and the deep mourning that followed Margaret's death, Michael, Anna, and Ethan knew that despite everything, life had to go on. The pain of absence was still there, but along with it came the responsibility to honor Margaret's memory and legacy. Everyone knew that it wasn't enough just to move on. They needed to do something meaningful, something that reflected the spirit of love and compassion that Margaret had always cultivated. The days that followed were filled with discussions about the future of the house. Michael and Anna, initially torn between keeping the house in the family or selling it, began to consider another possibility. Ethan, as heir to the estate, was a central part of these conversations. He knew that Margaret had trusted him to look after the house, and the idea of turning it into a place of greater purpose began to emerge. One quiet afternoon, as the three of them sat in the living room, looking at the old photos of Margaret scattered across the shelves, Anna raised the question they were all considering. What if we did something else with this house? Something that could really reflect who our mother was? Michael looked at his sister, still uncertain. What are you suggesting? Anna sighed, adjusting the photo of her mother in her hands. She was always a generous person who cared deeply about others. She never failed to help someone, even when she herself was alone. Maybe, instead of selling or simply keeping the house, we can turn it into something that continues that legacy of care. Ethan, sitting next to Anna, nodded slowly. I've been thinking about that too. Mrs. Margaret always talked about how much she cared about taking care of others, especially when she started to need care herself. Perhaps we can make this house a place where elderly people who, like her, need company and support can live. Michael was silent for a moment, pondering the idea. You want to turn the house into a home for the elderly? Not just a home, Anna replied, with a new sparkle in her eyes. A place where they can feel loved, cared for, like our mother felt with Ethan. A home where they're not alone, like she was for so long. The idea seemed to gain strength as Anna's words echoed around the room. Ethan, who had already spent so much time looking after Margaret, knew how important this mission would be. If this is something you think would make sense, I would be honored to continue the work I started with your mother, he said, his voice full of emotion. I promised her that I would take care of this house, and I think this would be the best way to honor that promise. Michael looked down at the floor, still struggling with the guilt of not having been there for the last few years of Margaret's life. But as he listened to Anna and Ethan's proposal, he began to see it as an opportunity to make up for his mistakes, to do something meaningful, something that could somehow make up for his absence. You're right, Ethan, Michael said, finally raising his eyes to face them both. Turning this house into a home for the elderly is the best way to keep her legacy alive. Our mother spent her last years alone, but with your help, Ethan, she found companionship and care. If we can do that for other people, then perhaps we can give to others what we didn't give to her. Anna smiled, agreeing. She'd be proud of us. Ethan nodded. So that's what we're going to do. With the decision made, the three of them set to work to turn their dream into reality. Michael used his connections in the real estate sector to ensure that the house complied with the rules and regulations to become a retirement home. Anna, with her experience in marketing and communications, began to publicize the project, ensuring that the community knew about the new space that would be available to those who needed it most. Ethan, for his part, plunged headlong into running the new home. He oversaw the renovations, ensuring that every room in the house was adapted to meet the needs of the future residents, but without losing the warm, familiar touch that Margaret had always cultivated. He wanted the home to be a reflection of Margaret herself, gentle, warm, and full of love. Months later, the house was ready. Now called Margaret House, the home for the elderly was a beautiful and serene space, where every detail reflected the affection and care that Margaret had always shown. The garden, which Margaret and Ethan tended together, blossomed with new life, and the once empty rooms were now occupied by people who, like Margaret, needed a place to call home in the last years of their lives. On the day of the inauguration, the local community gathered to celebrate the opening of the new space. Michael and Anna were there, as was Ethan, who was now responsible for running the home. As people walked through the rooms, admiring the welcoming atmosphere, Michael couldn't help but feel a deep emotion at seeing what they had created. Anna approached her brother, gently touching his arm. She'd be so happy about that. Michael looked around, his heart feeling lighter than it had in years. Yes, she would. I think that, in some way, we're finally doing what she always wanted, taking care of people. Ethan, who had been watching from afar, approached the two of them, a smile on his face. We did it. As the sun set, casting a golden light over Margaret House, the trio stood in silence for a moment, admiring the work they had done. It was a new phase in their lives, one in which regret and pain had been transformed into something greater. Margaret's legacy lived on, not only in the memories of her children, but also in the love and care that would now be offered to so many others. Ethan, said Michael, looking at the young caregiver, you were the best thing that ever happened to our mother, and now you'll be the best thing for so many other people. Ethan smiled, touched. I just hope I live up to what she believed. Margaret was special, and it's an honor to continue what she started. As night fell, Michael, Anna, and Ethan knew that despite the mistakes of the past, they had found a way to honor Margaret in the most meaningful way possible. Margaret House was more than just a home for the elderly. It was a symbol of love, redemption, and, above all, the care that Margaret had always offered and would now continue to offer forever. If you enjoyed this video and want to hear more stories like this one, we have prepared the next video just for you. Click here to watch.